The alarm on my wristpad started buzzing before I had even finished reading the message. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something closer to relief. 7 years of waiting had come down to this single line of text glowing on my screen. Request accepted. The Galactic Council would meet with humanity one final time. My name is Daniel Foss, and until that morning I was nothing more than a tired diplomat working out of a cramped office on a station most people forgot existed. I had spent a decade sending reports that nobody read, filing complaints that vanished into silence, and watching my species get pushed further and further into a corner of the galaxy that nobody else wanted. That morning, everything changed, and I did not yet know how much. I want to tell you what it felt like to be human in those years before the meeting. Imagine being the newest person at a job where everyone else has worked for centuries. Imagine every mistake you make being written into permanent record, while the mistakes of others are quietly erased. Imagine asking for a seat at the table and being handed a smaller chair instead. That was humanity's place among the stars. We had earned our way into space only a few generations after learning to fly, and the galaxy had never let us forget how young we were. The Council called us reckless. They called us unpredictable. They said our species grew too fast, expanded too fast, dreamed too fast. So they built walls around us, using words instead of steel, treaties, accords, restricted zones, tariffs so heavy that our trade ships barely broke even. Every time we tried to grow, some new rule appeared to stop us, always signed by delegates who smiled while they did it. I remember the day the Aphelion Accords were signed. I was young then, barely out of training, standing in the back of a room while older diplomats argued for hours and lost every point. The Accords limited how far human ships could travel, how many colonies we could build, even how many children could be born on frontier worlds without special permission. It was presented to us as protection. Protection for us, they said, and protection for everyone else from us. I remember walking out of that room feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. For years after that, I did my job. I filed the paperwork. I attended the small meetings they allowed us. I smiled when I had to, and stayed quiet when it counted. But every night, I read the reports coming in from human systems, and I saw something the Council refused to see. We were not shrinking under their restrictions. We were adapting. Colonies that were told they could not expand outward began building downward and upward instead, carving cities into asteroids the Council never bothered to inspect because they assumed we lacked the ability. Engineers who were denied advanced starship licenses built new designs from principles the Council considered outdated and made them work better than anything the older species had built in a century. Every restriction became a puzzle, and humanity has always been good at solving puzzles when given no other option. I did not know the full scope of what was happening. Nobody outside a very small circle did. I only saw pieces, a shipment of rare materials that disappeared from official records, a colony that reported a smaller population than satellite scans suggested it should have, a supply convoy that took a strange route and arrived earlier than physics should have allowed. I noticed these things the way you notice a single loose thread on a sweater, without understanding that the whole garment is unraveling. 6 months before I sent the final meeting request, I was called into a private room by a woman named Karen Voss, who at the time held a position so quiet that most people did not know it existed. She led something called the Continuity Office, a small department buried deep inside human administration that answered to almost no one outside our own government. She offered me tea, which should have been my first warning, because Karen never wasted time on pleasantries unless she needed something important from you. She told me humanity was ready. I asked ready for what? She said, ready to stop asking. I did not understand at first. I asked her what she meant, and she simply slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were reports I had never seen before, numbers that did not match anything in the public record. Ship counts, fleet positions, production capacity from colonies the Council believed were barely surviving. I remember sitting there in silence, turning pages, feeling the shape of the last decade rearrange itself in my mind. While the Council spent years restricting our expansion outward, humanity had been building inward and downward and in places no one thought to look. While they limited how many colonies we could establish, our engineers built cities that housed 10 times the population any surface settlement could hold. While they denied us military development under the excuse of peacekeeping, our defense forces trained using simulations and technology built entirely within the boundaries of what was technically allowed, because nobody had thought to write a rule against creativity. Karen told me something I have never forgotten. She said the Council taught us how to survive their rules by writing rules so specific that they left gaps large enough to build an empire through. She said humanity did not break a single law. We simply became something the law never imagined. I asked her why she was telling me this. She said because I was going to be the one to end it. I laughed, because it seemed impossible. I was a mid-level diplomat with no real power, sent to meetings that rarely mattered, tasked with reporting complaints that were rarely addressed. Karen told me that was exactly why it had to be me. Nobody expected anything from me. Nobody watched me closely. Nobody in the Council saw my name and felt worried. That made me the perfect person to request a meeting that would change everything, because nobody would suspect the reason behind the request until it was far too late to matter. Over the following months, I learned more than I ever expected to know about what my own people had built without me realizing it. I learned about deep colony networks hidden inside asteroid belts the Council had declared uninhabitable in their own surveys centuries ago. I learned about training programs designed to prepare crews for ships that officially did not exist yet, ships being built in shipyards disguised as mining operations. I learned that for every ship the Council counted in their official registry of human vessels, there were several more that had never been registered at all, because nobody required us to register something they did not know to look for. None of this was built to attack anyone. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes after. Humanity did not build an empire to conquer the galaxy or to punish the species who had wronged us. We built it because a people who are told they will never be allowed to grow will find a way to grow anyway, quietly, patiently, until the day arrives when quiet is no longer necessary. I spent the last month before the meeting learning how to speak the words Karen and her team had written for me. Every sentence had a purpose. Every pause was planned. I practiced in front of a mirror in my small quarters, saying the same lines over and over until they felt natural instead of rehearsed. I was told that the meeting had to look ordinary from the outside, just another tired human diplomat asking for another small concession, expecting to be denied like always. The morning I sent the request, my hands trembled as I typed it. I asked for a final review of the Aphelion Accords, framed as a routine appeal, the kind that gets filed every few years and rejected within days. I attached the usual documents. I used the usual polite language the Council expected from us. I made sure nothing in the request suggested anything unusual was happening. The reply came faster than I expected. The Council agreed to meet, and their tone in the message was almost bored, as if they were doing me a favor simply by reading it. I remember staring at that message for a long time, feeling the weight of what it meant settle into my chest. This was not a favor. This was the last door they would ever open for us on their own terms. Karen contacted me an hour later. She told me the fleet movements would begin the moment I stepped into the meeting room. She told me not to worry about anything happening outside that room because it was no longer my responsibility. My only job was to sit across from the Council, deliver the words we had prepared, and let time do the rest. I asked her what would happen if it failed. She was quiet for a moment before answering. She said it would not fail, because we were not asking the Council for permission anymore. We were informing them of a decision that had already been made. That sentence stayed with me during the entire trip to the station where the meeting would take place. I sat alone in my quarters on the transport ship, looking out at the stars passing by, thinking about every meeting I had attended over the years, where I sat quietly while other species decided what my people were allowed to become. I thought about every young engineer back home who built something incredible using restrictions as inspiration instead of limitation. I thought about every colony that grew in silence because growing loudly was never an option we were given. I also thought about the risk. Karen's plan depended on precise timing, on years of preparation staying hidden until the exact right moment, on delegates who trusted their own sense of superiority so completely that they never imagined the species they underestimated could be capable of something this large. If even one part of the plan had leaked, if even one delegate suspected what was coming, everything could have unraveled before I ever reached the meeting room. I did not sleep well during that trip. I kept running through the words I had memorized, checking them against the plan, wondering if I would remember everything when the moment arrived. I am not ashamed to admit that I was afraid. Not afraid of failing to deliver a speech, but afraid of the responsibility resting on my shoulders. An entire species had spent years preparing for this day, and I was the one who had to walk into that room and set everything into motion with nothing more than careful words and steady breathing. When the transport finally arrived at Aurelian 9, the neutral station chosen for the meeting, I stood at the viewport and looked out at the structure floating against the black of space. It was enormous, built centuries ago by an alliance of older species as a place where disputes could be settled without any single government holding an advantage. Humanity had been allowed onto that station only a handful of times before, always under careful watch, always treated like guests who might break something valuable if left unattended. I straightened my uniform, took a slow breath, and reminded myself of what Karen had told me before I left. She said history does not remember the people who accepted small chairs at large tables. It remembers the people who decided, quietly and firmly, that they deserved a seat equal to everyone else in the room. As the transport docked and the doors opened, I stepped forward into the station corridor, feeling the weight of every year of restriction pressing against my chest, and beneath it, something new. Something that felt almost like hope, sharpened into patience, ready to be spent all at once. I did not know exactly what would happen once I sat down across from the council. I only knew that after this day, nothing about humanity's place among the stars would ever be the same again. And somewhere behind me, hidden in systems the council had never bothered to watch closely, the ships were already moving. The meeting room on Aurelian 9 was colder than I expected, and I do not mean the temperature. I mean the feeling in the air, the sense that every surface in that chamber had been designed to remind visitors of their place. The walls curved upward into a high ceiling made of dark glass, and through it, the stars looked less like something beautiful and more like an audience, watching from a distance, waiting to see what would happen. 11 delegates sat along a curved table shaped like a crescent moon, each one representing a species that had shaped galactic politics long before humanity had learned to leave its own solar system. I walked in alone, carrying only a single datapad and the weight of everything I had been asked to do. I remember the sound of my own footsteps on the polished floor, steady and slow, because Karen had told me that rushing into that room would make me look nervous, and nervous was the last thing I could afford to look. The delegate closest to the center was a tall, pale being named Threlkos, representing the species that had chaired the council for as long as anyone could remember. His skin had a faint blue shimmer under the chamber lights, and his eyes held the kind of patience that comes from centuries of never being questioned. Beside him sat Vantra, a delegate whose species communicated through a series of low humming tones that a translator device converted into speech, though her actual voice remained a soft vibration beneath the words. Further down the table sat Doran, representing one of the oldest trading alliances in the galaxy, a being covered in fine golden scales who tapped his fingers against the table with the impatience of someone who considered this meeting a waste of valuable time. I took my seat at the small chair positioned at the open end of the crescent table, facing all 11 of them at once. It was, I noticed, a slightly smaller chair than the ones the delegates used. I had seen this detail before in other meetings, and every time it had made me feel like a child sitting at a table built for adults. This time, I simply noted it, filed it away, and said nothing. Threlko spoke first, his translated voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone greeting a guest he did not consider important. He welcomed me to the chamber and asked what matter humanity wished to bring before the council on this occasion. I could hear the slight edge of amusement in his tone, the assumption that whatever I said next would be another small complaint, easily dismissed, easily forgotten by the time the next session began. I began exactly as we had planned. I thanked the council for agreeing to meet, and I opened my datapad to display the first set of figures. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply began reading through a ledger, calm and precise, item by item, the way an accountant reads through a list of debts owed. I described the trade restrictions placed on human systems 11 years earlier, restrictions that reduced our export value by more than half while allowing member species unrestricted access to our raw materials. I described the travel limitations imposed under the Aphelion Accords, which confined human expansion to a narrow band of space while other species expanded freely in every direction. I described the Military Oversight Committee that inspected our defense capabilities twice a year, a level of scrutiny applied to no other species in the Council's history. As I spoke, I watched the delegates' expressions shift slightly, not with concern, but with the mild boredom of people listening to a complaint they had heard 100 times before in slightly different words. Doran yawned without covering his mouth. Vantra's humming grew quieter, almost absent-minded. Threlko simply nodded along, the way someone nods at a child, explaining why a broken toy is unfair. I continued anyway, because every word mattered, and because Karen had told me that the numbers themselves were not the point. The point was establishing, clearly and on formal record, exactly what had been taken from humanity over the years, so that later, no one could claim they had never been told. When I finished the ledger, I closed the datapad and looked directly at Threlkos. I told him that humanity requested the full and immediate withdrawal of the Aphelion Accords, along with the removal of all trade restrictions and military oversight measures currently placed upon our systems. The room went quiet for a moment, and then several of the delegates laughed. Not cruelly, but with the kind of light amusement people show when a request seems so unreasonable that it does not require serious consideration. Doran said something about young species always overestimating their own importance. Vantra's translator produced a soft, almost pitying tone, saying that the Accords existed for the protection of the wider galaxy, and that humanity should be grateful such protections had kept us from harming ourselves or others during our reckless early years of expansion. Threlkos raised a hand, quieting the room with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed instantly. He turned to me and explained, slowly, as if speaking to someone who might not fully grasp the situation, that the Accords had been in place for 11 years without incident. Proof, he said, that they were working exactly as intended. He said the Council understood that young species often felt frustrated by necessary limitations, but that patience was part of growing into a mature member of galactic society. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. When he was done, I simply said thank you, and I meant it, because his answer gave me exactly the response Karen had predicted he would give. I told the Council I understood their position completely, and that I appreciated them taking the time to explain it so clearly. Then I told them there was one more thing I needed to say before the meeting concluded. I said that this had been requested as the final meeting between humanity and the Galactic Council, and I wanted to make sure that phrase was properly understood before we parted ways. Threlkos tilted his head slightly, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw something other than amusement cross his expression. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, a flicker of curiosity mixed with the first trace of unease. He asked me to clarify what I meant by the word final. I told him that humanity did not intend to request another meeting after this one. I said it as plainly and calmly as I could, without any hint of threat in my voice, because the plan depended on the delegates believing this was simply a strange choice of words from an inexperienced diplomat, rather than a warning. Doran asked, with a note of irritation creeping into his tone, whether humanity intended to withdraw from council proceedings entirely, perhaps in some symbolic protest. I told him no, that was not quite right either, but I did not elaborate further. I had been instructed very specifically not to explain anything beyond what was necessary, because every extra word risked giving away more than the council needed to know before the timing was right. Vantra's translator hummed out a question, asking what exactly humanity expected to happen if the council refused this request, as they clearly intended to. I answered honestly, because Karen had told me honesty here would serve us better than any clever evasion. I said that I did not expect anything sudden to happen. I said that humanity was simply done asking, and that whatever came next would come regardless of what was decided in this room today. The delegates exchanged glances with each other, murmuring quietly in their own languages before their translators caught up and rendered the words into something I could understand. Most of what I heard was dismissive, a mixture of confusion and mild concern that quickly faded back into the same tired condescension I had grown used to over the years. A few delegates further down the table barely seemed to register what I had said at all, already shifting their attention to other matters on their own personal data displays. Threlkos, however, remained still for a long moment, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not quite fit the picture they expected. He asked one final question before formally closing the session. He asked whether this meant humanity intended to isolate itself completely from galactic affairs, cutting off diplomatic contact entirely. I told him that humanity would always remain part of the galaxy. I said we simply intended to participate in it differently going forward. I chose those words very carefully, because they were true in every sense, even though Threlkos could not possibly understand yet exactly how differently things were about to change. He nodded slowly, clearly still turning the conversation over in his mind, though not with any real alarm. He formally noted, for the record, that the Council rejected humanity's request to withdraw the Aphelion Accords and associated restrictions. He thanked me for bringing the matter before them, in the same distant tone he might use to thank a servant for delivering a message, and he declared the session concluded. I stood, gathered my datapad, and thanked the Council once more for their time. I walked out of that chamber the same way I had walked in, slow and steady, though my heart was pounding harder than it had during any moment of my life before that day. Behind me, I could hear the faint murmur of delegates already moving on to their next order of business, already forgetting the strange human diplomat and his oddly final farewell. As the doors closed behind me, and I stepped into the quiet corridor outside, I allowed myself one slow breath, the first real breath I had taken since entering that room. I pulled out my communicator, and a message from Karen was already waiting, sent the moment my location data confirmed I had left the chamber. It contained only 3 words: "It has begun." I stood there in that empty corridor of Aurelian 9, staring at those 3 words, knowing that somewhere far beyond that station, ships that had waited years in silence were finally beginning to move, and that the delegates still sitting comfortably in that chamber behind me had no idea that the final meeting they had just dismissed so easily was about to become the last ordinary day they would ever experience among the stars. I did not leave Aurelian 9 right away. Karen's instructions were clear on this point. I was to remain on the station, quietly, in my assigned quarters, until further notice. She said my presence there mattered more than anything I could do anywhere else, because a diplomat who vanished the moment a meeting ended would raise questions, and questions were the one thing we could not afford yet. So I sat in my small room near the docking ring, watching the same 3 words on my communicator screen. It has begun. I did not know exactly what those words meant in practical terms, not yet, but I understood the shape of it. Somewhere far from that station, in systems the Council had long dismissed as unimportant, ships that had waited in silence for years were finally moving. I want to explain, as clearly as I can, what actually happened during those first hours, because I only learned the full picture later, pieced together from reports Karen shared with me, once the danger of leaks no longer mattered. I am telling it now the way I understand it, so you can see what the Council could not. Every species that sat on that council depended on humanity in ways they had spent years pretending not to notice. Ships built by other governments used navigation systems designed and maintained by human engineers, because our approach to long-range calculation had proven more efficient than anything the older species had developed themselves, even while our physical maps were legally restricted to smaller, controlled zones. Communication relays scattered throughout council space ran on software written by human programmers, hired quietly through private contracts that never appeared in official council records because human labor was inexpensive and reliable, and nobody asked too many questions about where it came from. For years, the council had taken those services and never once questioned what would happen if humanity decided to stop offering them. The moment I left that meeting chamber, a series of prepared instructions went out across every human-held network. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was attacked. That is important to understand, because I know how this could sound if told wrong. No violence occurred in those opening hours. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways far more effective than any attack could have been. Every human-maintained system across council space simply stopped following updates. Navigation relays that depended on human calculation began reverting to older, slower models built by the species that owned them, models that had not been properly maintained in decades because everyone assumed humanity would always be there to patch the gaps. Communication networks that ran through human-built infrastructure began experiencing delays, not failures, just delays, small ones at first, minutes turning into hours as automated systems detected the change in maintenance schedules and began falling back to backup protocols nobody had tested in years. At the same time, in systems far beyond the reach of council inspection, in asteroid belts and hollowed-out moons that had been declared uninhabitable by surveys taken over a century ago, thousands of ships began moving out of hidden shipyards. These were not the small trade vessels the council believed represented the extent of human capability. These were ships built patiently, over years, using designs that combined old principles the council considered outdated with new engineering nobody outside a small circle of human scientists had ever seen. I learned later that the fleet numbered well over 4,000 vessels, a number that would have seemed impossible to any council official who reviewed our official registry, which listed barely 300 ships across all of human space. The difference between those numbers represented years of quiet work, careful secrecy, and a decision made long before I was ever told about it, that humanity would prepare for a day it hoped would never come, but would be ready for regardless. These ships did not move toward council territory to attack anyone. Their orders, from what Karen told me afterward, were simple and specific. Move into position around every major transit route connecting council-held space to the systems where individual delegate governments were based. Do not fire on anyone. Do not block civilian traffic. Simply become present, visible, undeniable, in numbers large enough that no one could pretend not to notice. While this was happening, back in the council chamber on Aurelian 9, the delegates continued their session, moving on to other matters entirely unrelated to humanity, unaware that the ordinary flow of information they depended on was already beginning to slow. I learned the details of what happened inside that chamber from a recording Karen shared with me weeks later, taken from a small device placed inside the room during my visit, hidden inside the datapad I had carried with me. I want to describe it now because I think it captures the moment better than anything I witnessed directly. About 2 hours after I left the meeting, an aide entered the chamber and whispered something to Doran, the golden-scaled delegate who had yawned through most of my presentation. Doran's expression shifted from mild irritation to genuine confusion as he listened. He interrupted the session, asking for a brief pause, and stepped away to review something on his own communicator. When he returned, his voice had lost its earlier boredom entirely. He announced that his home government's transit authority was reporting unusual delays across several major shipping lanes, delays that seemed to be originating from failures in the communication relay network. He asked if anyone else had received similar reports. Several other delegates checked their own communicators, and one by one, their expressions changed in the same way Doran's had. Vantra's translator produced a low, uncertain hum as she reported that her government's long-range sensors, which relied on calculation models developed under a human engineering contract, were returning inconsistent results, off by margins too small to be immediately alarming, but large enough to notice. Threlkos, still composed, suggested this was likely a temporary technical issue, the kind that occurred occasionally across such a large network of interconnected systems. He asked the council secretary to contact the appropriate maintenance division and have the issue resolved before the next session. The secretary attempted to do exactly that. According to the recording, she spent nearly 20 minutes trying to reach anyone within the maintenance contractors responsible for the affected systems. Every contact channel returned the same result. No response. Not an error message, not a busy signal, simply silence. The kind of silence that comes from someone choosing not to answer rather than being unable to. By the time the session reconvened, after a short recess, 3 more delegates had received reports of delays affecting their own territories. A representative named Solvis, whose species controlled several key trading routes near what the council still referred to as the Outer Restricted Zone, that same narrow band of space humanity had been confined to under the Aphelion Accords, reported something far more alarming than delayed communications. Solvis said that long-range sensors near the restricted zone's border had detected a large number of unidentified vessels, moving in formation, holding position along multiple transit routes without making any aggressive movements, but present in numbers his analysts could not yet explain. I remember Karen telling me, when she eventually described this part of the recording to me, that this was the exact moment the mood in that chamber changed permanently. Up until Solvis spoke, the delegates had treated the disruptions as an inconvenience, a technical problem to be solved quietly before it embarrassed anyone. Once Solvis mentioned the ships, the room fell into a silence that the recording captured perfectly, a silence heavier than anything that had existed during my own visit hours earlier. Threlkos asked Solvis to confirm the origin of the vessels. Solvis hesitated before answering, and when he finally spoke, his translated voice carried a tone none of the earlier arrogance remained in. He said preliminary analysis suggested the ships matched engineering signatures associated with human production facilities, though the number and design far exceeded anything in the Council's official records of human capability. I want to pause here and describe something important, because I think it explains why this moment mattered so much. For years, the Council had built its entire relationship with humanity around a single assumption, that we were exactly as capable as our official registry suggested, no more and no less. Every restriction, every tariff, every inspection had been designed around that assumption. The realization that the assumption might be wrong did not just threaten their plans, it threatened the entire foundation of how they understood their place above us. Doran, no longer bored in the slightest, asked whether this meant humanity had violated the Aphelion Accords by constructing ships beyond the permitted limit. Threlkos, for the first time in the recording, did not answer immediately. He sat quietly for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice had lost the calm certainty it carried during my own meeting hours earlier. He said the Council would need to review the exact wording of the Accords before making any formal accusation. He said this slowly, almost carefully, and I think by that point he had already begun to understand what many of the other delegates had not yet realized. The Accords had never explicitly limited how many ships humanity could build within our own territory, only how far those ships could travel beyond it. Nothing happening at that moment technically violated a single word of the agreement they had spent 11 years enforcing against us. Vantra asked what the ships intended to do, given that they had not attacked anyone or attempted to cross into Council space itself. Threlkos admitted he did not know, and I remember Karen telling me that admission mattered more than almost anything else said in that entire session, because it was the first time in longer than anyone could remember that the Council's leading delegate had openly confessed uncertainty in front of the others. The session continued for several more hours, growing increasingly tense as more reports arrived from different delegate governments, each one describing similar patterns: communication delays, sensor inconsistencies, ships appearing near transit routes in numbers too large to ignore, but positioned in ways that made no aggressive move whatsoever. By the end of that day, every delegate on the council understood that something enormous had shifted beneath them, though none of them yet understood exactly what it meant, or what humanity intended to do next. I remained in my quarters on Aurelian 9 throughout all of this, following updates from Karen as they came in, feeling a strange mixture of pride and fear that I still find difficult to describe. Pride, because I finally understood the scale of what my people had built while I sat filing paperwork nobody read. Fear, because I understood that the plan depended entirely on the council choosing restraint over retaliation, and there was no way to know for certain which path they would choose until it happened. Karen contacted me directly late that evening, her voice steady over the secure channel, and she told me the next phase would begin the following day. She said the council would likely attempt to gather more information, perhaps even attempt direct contact with human authorities to demand an explanation. She told me to expect a summons back to the chamber, and she told me exactly what to say when it came. I asked her if she thought this would work. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and her answer has stayed with me since. She said it did not matter whether it worked in the way we hoped, because there was no version of this plan that led back to the way things had been before. The only question left was what kind of new arrangement would replace it, and whether the council would help decide that arrangement or simply have it decided for them. I slept very little that night, listening to the quiet hum of the station around me, knowing that somewhere out among the stars, thousands of ships sat waiting in silence, holding their position, giving the council every opportunity to choose a peaceful path forward, while making it clear, without a single weapon fired, that humanity would never again accept being told what it was allowed to become. The summons came just after dawn on the station clock, delivered by the same aide who had escorted me to the chamber the day before. Her expression was different this time. The polite indifference from yesterday had been replaced by something tighter, more careful, as if she had been told to watch me closely without being told exactly why. I walked through the same corridors as before, past the same dark glass walls, and I noticed immediately that the atmosphere on the station itself had changed overnight. Staff moved faster than they had the previous day. Small groups of aides stood in side corridors, speaking in hushed tones, falling silent whenever I passed. I kept my expression calm, remembering everything Karen had told me the night before, though my heart was pounding the entire walk to the chamber doors. When I entered, the room felt different from the one I had left less than a day earlier. The delegates sat in the same crescent formation, but their posture had changed entirely. Threlkos no longer wore the relaxed confidence I remembered from our first meeting. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, still, controlled, the posture of someone working very hard to appear composed while feeling anything but calm underneath. He did not wait for pleasantries this time. As soon as I took my seat, he asked me directly what humanity intended by positioning armed vessels near multiple transit routes throughout Council territory. I answered exactly as planned, my voice steady despite the pressure building in my chest. I told him that no human vessel had crossed into Council space, and that every ship currently positioned near those transit routes remained entirely within territory humanity already controlled under existing agreements. I reminded him, gently, that the Aphelion Accords restricted how far our ships could travel beyond our borders, not how many ships we were permitted to build or where we could position them within our own systems. Doran interrupted, his golden scales catching the light as he leaned forward with obvious frustration. He said the sheer number of ships suggested clear preparation for confrontation, regardless of technical legality. I told him that preparation and confrontation were not the same thing, and that humanity had made no aggressive move of any kind. I reminded the Council that not a single weapon had been fired, not a single ship had been damaged, and not a single life had been threatened during the entire course of these movements. Vantra's translator hummed out a question, laced with something that sounded almost like desperation beneath the careful diplomatic phrasing. She asked what humanity actually wanted, since it was clear by now that this went far beyond a simple appeal regarding trade restrictions. This was the moment Karen had prepared me for most carefully, and I chose my words exactly as we had practiced. I told the council that humanity wanted exactly what I had requested during our previous meeting, nothing more and nothing less: the full withdrawal of the Aphelion Accords. The removal of trade restrictions imposed unfairly upon our systems. The end of military oversight measures applied to no other member species. I told them that this request had not changed overnight, only the council's understanding of what would happen if it continued to be refused. Threlkos asked what would happen if the council refused again. I told him the truth, because Karen had insisted honesty remained our strongest tool throughout this entire process. I told him that nothing would happen immediately. No ship would attack, no system would be seized. Humanity did not intend to take anything from the council that did not already belong to us. I explained that every delegate in that room remained completely free to leave Aurelian 9 at any moment, using any ship available to them, traveling to any destination they chose. I told them plainly that humanity held no hostages and threatened no violence against any individual present. Doran asked, with obvious suspicion, what the ships and the communication disruptions were meant to accomplish, if not to force compliance through threat. I told him it was simple, though I understood how difficult it must have been for him to hear. I explained that humanity no longer intended to provide services, maintenance, and support to a council that had spent over a decade treating us as a problem to be managed, rather than a partner to be respected. I told him the navigation systems, the communication relays, the trade infrastructure that so many council governments depended upon had all been built and maintained through human labor and human engineering, offered freely for years despite the restrictions placed against us in return. I said that arrangement was now ending, not through force, not through violence, but through the simple and entirely legal choice to stop offering services that were never actually required of us in the first place. The room fell silent for a long moment. I watched several delegates glance nervously at their own communicators, no doubt checking the status of systems back in their home territories, systems that had likely continued deteriorating throughout the night as more automated processes reverted to older, unsupported models. Threlkos asked, his voice quieter now than I had ever heard it, what humanity required in exchange for restoring these services and withdrawing the fleet from its current positions. I told him the terms were exactly what I had stated the day before. Full withdrawal of the Aphelion Accords, complete removal of trade restrictions, an end to military oversight. I added one additional condition, one Karen had instructed me to deliver, only if the conversation reached this exact point. I told the council that going forward, humanity required equal standing in all future council proceedings, meaning full voting rights, full representation, and full access to any resource or system available to every other member species without exception. Vantra asked what would happen if individual delegate governments refused these terms even after the majority of the council agreed to them. I told her that any government choosing to refuse would simply continue operating under current conditions, without access to human engineering support, human trade goods, or human-held systems, for as long as they chose to maintain that position. I made it clear that humanity was not demanding universal agreement through pressure. We were simply withdrawing the assistance we had always offered voluntarily, and allowing each government to decide for itself whether continuing without that assistance was sustainable. Doran asked, almost bitterly, whether this had been the plan from the very beginning, whether the meeting the day before had been nothing more than a formality designed to set this exact confrontation into motion. I answered honestly, because there was no point pretending otherwise at this stage. I told him yes, this had been planned for years, quietly and carefully, because words alone had never worked in convincing the council to treat humanity as an equal partner rather than a problem requiring constant supervision. I told him that humanity had exhausted every diplomatic option available to us long before I ever sent that meeting request, and that this approach, while difficult, was the only one left that did not involve anyone being harmed. Threlkos sat quietly for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point on the table in front of him. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something I had never heard from him before, a kind of tired resignation that replaced the confident authority I remembered from our first meeting. He asked for time to consult privately with the other delegates before providing any formal response. I told him that was entirely reasonable, and I informed him that humanity was prepared to wait as long as necessary, because unlike previous negotiations, there was no deadline pressuring us to accept a rushed or incomplete resolution. I explained, as gently as I could, that the fleet would remain in position, causing no harm to anyone, for as long as it took the Council to reach a decision they were fully comfortable with. I want to describe something I noticed in that room during the recess that followed, because I think it mattered more than almost anything else that happened that day. As the delegates gathered into smaller groups to discuss their response privately, I watched years of practiced hierarchy begin quietly dissolving in front of me. Delegates who had barely acknowledged each other during previous sessions now spoke urgently, checking figures, comparing notes on how deeply their own governments depended on the very systems humanity had built and maintained without ever receiving proper credit or fair compensation. I sat quietly at my small chair during this recess, watching the council I had always known, an institution that had seemed permanent and unshakable for my entire career, begin the slow process of recognizing that the foundation beneath it had shifted overnight in ways none of them had prepared for. When the session resumed several hours later, Threlkos spoke first, his voice steady but noticeably changed from the confident tone he had used during our very first meeting. He informed me that the Council required additional time to review the full scope of humanity's demands, but that preliminary discussions suggested a majority of delegates were prepared to begin formal negotiations toward meeting most of the conditions I had outlined. I told him that humanity welcomed any sincere effort toward fair negotiation, and that the fleet would remain positioned peacefully throughout the process, neither advancing nor withdrawing, until an agreement acceptable to both sides had been reached. As I left the chamber that second time, I felt something different from the fear and uncertainty that had followed me out the day before. I felt a strange, quiet steadiness, the feeling of having finally said everything that needed saying after years of silence, and having been heard, perhaps for the first time in the entire history of our relationship with the wider galaxy. I did not yet know how long the negotiations would take, or exactly what shape the final agreement would eventually take. But walking back through those cold, glass-lined corridors of Aurelian 9, I understood clearly that the balance which had defined humanity's place among the stars for over a decade had shifted permanently, and there would be no returning to the arrangement that existed before I sent that single, quiet meeting request. The negotiations lasted 11 days. I remember counting each one, marking them off in a small notebook I kept in my quarters, because Karen had told me that tracking the passage of time carefully would help me stay grounded during a process designed to stretch on far longer than anyone expected. 11 days does not sound like much when spoken aloud, but living through them felt like reliving every frustrating year of restriction humanity had endured, compressed into a single stretch of tense, uncertain waiting. During those days, I remained on Aurelian 9, attending session after session, watching delegates who had once treated me with polite dismissal now speak to me with careful, measured respect. Threlkos, in particular, changed the most. By the fourth day, he had stopped addressing me the way one might address a representative of a lesser species, and started speaking to me the way colleagues speak to each other, even in disagreement. I learned quickly that not every government within the Council responded to the situation the same way. Some delegates, like Vantra, seemed almost relieved once the initial shock passed, admitting privately, during a quiet moment between sessions, that her own government had long questioned whether the restrictions placed on humanity were fair or necessary in the first place. Others, like Doran, remained resistant far longer, clinging to the belief that some show of strength might still reverse the situation in the Council's favor. On the 6th day, Doran's government attempted exactly that. I learned about it from Karen, who received the report through channels far faster than anything shared officially within the chamber. Doran's home fleet, a modest force by human standards but historically significant within his own trading alliance, attempted to reposition several vessels toward one of the transit routes where human ships held their position. I want to be clear about what happened next, because it mattered enormously in shaping how the rest of the negotiation unfolded. The human fleet did not fire. It did not retreat. It simply adjusted formation slightly, calmly, without a single aggressive action, in a way that made it clear the approaching vessels could not pass without initiating conflict themselves. Doran's ships, faced with that quiet, immovable presence, and receiving no orders to escalate further from a government suddenly uncertain of its own strength, compared to what humanity had revealed, turned back without incident. I remember Threlkos addressing this event directly during the following session, his tone carrying a weight that had not been present during our earlier meetings. He stated, formally and for the official record, that any further attempt by a member government to test humanity's positions through military posturing would not be tolerated by the Council as a whole, because such actions risked catastrophic consequences that served no one's interest. I watched Doran's expression during that statement, and I saw, for the first time, something that looked almost like genuine acceptance settle over him. By the 8th day, the framework of a new agreement had taken clear shape. The Aphelion Accords would be formally dissolved, effective immediately upon signing. Trade restrictions placed on human systems would be lifted in stages over the following year, allowing both human and Council economies time to adjust to fully open exchange. Military oversight measures would end entirely, replaced instead by a mutual observation agreement applied equally to every member species, humanity included, removing the singular scrutiny we had endured for over a decade. The final and most significant point, humanity's request for full and equal standing within the Council itself, took the longest to resolve, precisely because it required every existing member government to fundamentally reconsider decades of assumed hierarchy. I sat through hours of debate on this single issue, watching delegates argue among themselves about precedent, about tradition, about what it would mean to grant a species so young the same voice and vote as governments that had shaped galactic politics for centuries. In the end, it was Vantra who spoke the words that seemed to settle the matter more than any argument I offered myself. She reminded the Council, quietly but firmly, that humanity had already demonstrated, through years of quiet innovation despite every restriction placed against us, a capability equal to or exceeding many of the species currently seated at that table. She said, continuing to deny equal standing to a species that had already proven itself equal in practice, served only to embarrass the Council further rather than protect any meaningful advantage. Threlkos called for a final vote on the 10th day. I remember sitting in that small chair, the same slightly smaller chair I had noticed during my very first visit to that chamber, waiting as each delegate cast their decision. 7 votes in favor, 3 against, 1 abstained. It was enough. The measure passed, and for the first time in humanity's history among the stars, we were formally recognized as an equal member of the Galactic Council, entitled to every right and privilege afforded to species who had walked among the stars long before we ever learned to leave our own world. The formal signing took place on the 11th day, in a slightly smaller chamber down the corridor from the main hall, attended only by the delegates and myself, along with a small team from the Continuity Office who had traveled from human space specifically for this moment. Karen herself stood quietly near the back of the room, watching everything unfold with the calm satisfaction of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this outcome. I signed the agreement on behalf of humanity, my hand steadier than I expected it to be, given everything that had led to this single moment. As I set down the pen, I felt the weight of the entire process finally begin to lift from my shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost unfamiliar after years of carrying quiet frustration everywhere I went. Threlkos approached me after the signing, and for the first time since I had met him, he extended his hand toward me directly, a gesture I had only ever seen exchanged between equals within council tradition. I shook it, and he told me, in a voice free of the condescension I remembered from our earliest meeting, that he looked forward to working alongside humanity as a true partner going forward, rather than a problem requiring careful management. I thanked him, and I meant it sincerely, because holding on to anger after achieving what we had set out to achieve would have served no purpose. The council had wronged humanity for years, but the point of everything Karen and her team had built was never revenge. It was equality, plain and simple, and now that equality had finally been secured, I left Aurelian 9 later that same day, boarding a transport back toward human space, and as the station shrank behind me through the viewport, I found myself thinking about the strange irony of everything that had happened. Humanity had requested one final meeting, and in doing so, we had ensured that the council, which had ruled over us so carelessly for so long, would never again meet on the same terms it once had. The version of the Galactic Council that returned to its home systems after that 11th day was not the same institution that had gathered on Aurelian 9 to hear my original request. It had been permanently changed, reshaped by a species it had spent years underestimating. I returned to human space, to a welcome I never expected. Karen met me personally at the docking bay, and for the first time since I had known her, she allowed herself a genuine smile as she shook my hand. She told me that the fleet had already begun standing down from its positions along the transit routes, returning quietly to the hidden shipyards and asteroid colonies where it had waited so patiently for so many years. She told me that trade ships were already preparing to move freely for the first time in over a decade, no longer confined to the narrow restrictions that had shaped so much of my career. I spent the following weeks traveling briefly through some of the frontier colonies that had built the fleet in secret, meeting engineers and workers who had spent years constructing something they hoped would never actually be needed, understanding fully for the first time the depth of sacrifice and patience that had gone into preparing for a single, decisive moment that lasted only 11 days but had been 11 years in the making. I often think back now to that quiet corridor on Aurelian 9, standing there after my very first meeting with the council, holding my communicator and reading those 3 simple words from Karen. It has begun. I did not understand then everything those words would come to mean, but I understand now that they marked the exact moment humanity stopped asking permission to exist freely among the stars, and started simply existing that way, on terms finally equal to everyone else. The Galactic Council still meets regularly, its sessions held now in a newly built chamber, designed with equal seating for every member species, humanity included. I sit at that table these days, no longer confined to a smaller chair positioned apart from the others, but seated among equals, contributing to decisions that shape the future of the entire galaxy rather than simply receiving decisions made without our input. And sometimes, during quiet moments between sessions, I remember standing in that observation deck the night before everything changed, watching the stars pass by, wondering whether the plan Karen and her team had spent years preparing would actually work. I remember the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of an entire species resting on careful words and steady patience. Humanity requested one final meeting, and the Galactic Council that walked into that chamber never truly returned home, not as the same institution it had been before. What returned instead was something new, reshaped permanently by a species finally recognized as equal, standing now among the stars, not as guests granted limited permission, but as partners who had earned their place through patience, preparation, and the quiet, unshakable resolve to never again accept anything less than what we deserved.